What if I told you that your government once sprayed an entire American city with bacteria, just to see what would happen? That agents once dosed unsuspecting citizens with LSD in a San Francisco brothel while watching through one-way mirrors? That the FBI once wiretapped a civil rights leader's hotel rooms and suggested in writing that he end his own life? You'd probably think this sounds like the plot of a late-night thriller. Something your uncle read on a forum at 2 in the morning. But here's the quiet, uncomfortable truth. Every single story you're about to hear tonight is real. Documented, declassified, verified by government records, court cases, and congressional hearings. These aren't rumors whispered in the dark. They're facts that sat locked away in filing cabinets and vaults until whistleblowers, lawsuits, and investigations slowly pulled them into the light. Tonight, we're going to move gently through 50 of these hidden chapters, the ones history class quietly skipped over. Stories about the FBI and the CIA, about experiments, cover-ups, and decisions made in rooms most Americans never knew existed. This isn't about painting anyone as a villain. It's simply about remembering what actually happened, so we can rest a little easier knowing the truth, rather than wondering about it. Before we drift into the past, if you don't mind, take a moment to hit subscribe and leave this video a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who enjoy falling asleep to real history, told slowly, calmly, honestly. Now get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let your body sink into the mattress. And let's begin, gently, with the first story, one that starts in a small county in Alabama, back in 1932. The first entry on our list takes us into the offices of J. Edgar Hoover himself, and a program that ran for 15 quiet years before anyone outside the Bureau knew it existed. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, began in 1956 and continued until 1971. Officially, it was designed to investigate and disrupt organizations the FBI considered subversive. In practice, it became something far broader and far more troubling. Agents infiltrated civil rights groups, anti-war organizations, socialist and communist parties, feminist collectives, and Native American activist movements. They didn't just watch, they intervened. Agents sent forged letters designed to break up marriages and friendships. They planted false stories in newspapers. They used informants to sow distrust inside organizations, encouraging members to suspect one another of being government spies, which in some cases they actually were. The Black Panther Party was a particular focus, with the FBI working to fuel conflict between the Panthers and rival groups, sometimes with deadly results. Martin Luther King Jr. was targeted too, monitored around the clock, his personal life scrutinized for anything that could be used against him. For 15 years, this all happened quietly, hidden from Congress, from the courts, and from the public. It wasn't ended by some noble whistleblower stepping forward. It was ended because a group of ordinary citizens broke into a small FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania in 1971 and walked out with over 1,000 classified documents which they mailed to newspapers. That's how the country first learned the word COINTELPRO. The Church Committee investigations later in the decade confirmed just how far the program had gone and how many lives it had quietly reshaped without their knowledge. And speaking of programs designed to reach directly into people's minds, let's drift towards something even stranger. MKUltra, the CIA's mind control experiments, ran from 1953 to 1973, a full 2 decades of secretive testing. The goal, according to declassified files, was to explore whether the human mind could be controlled, broken down, or rebuilt through drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation. LSD was a favorite tool. So were electroshock treatments, isolation chambers, and sleep deprivation. Some subjects volunteered, at least in a limited sense. Many did not. Prisoners, mental health patients, and members of the public were dosed without their knowledge or consent. One especially unsettling branch of the program, sometimes referred to as Operation Midnight Climax, involved CIA-run safe houses in cities like San Francisco and New York, where unsuspecting visitors were given LSD-laced drinks while agents observed their reactions from behind one-way mirrors. The man overseeing much of this, chemist Sidney Gottlieb, later ordered the destruction of most MKUltra records in 1973, right as public scrutiny began to build. What survived only came to light because of a small batch of financial documents that had been misfiled elsewhere. One of the most haunting stories tied to this era involves a scientist named Frank Olson, who fell to his death from a hotel window days after unknowingly being dosed with LSD by his own colleagues. The official explanation has shifted over the decades, and his family has long questioned whether the full truth was ever told. It remains even now an open question rather than a settled one. What we do know for certain is that for 20 years, the CIA experimented on human minds without their permission, and only fragments of that story survive to be told at all. And speaking of the CIA reaching into places it perhaps shouldn't have, some researchers believe the agency didn't stop at minds. It also reached into newsrooms. Operation Mockingbird is the name most often attached to this theory, describing an alleged effort by the CIA to cultivate relationships with journalists and media organizations in order to shape public opinion, both at home and abroad. According to this account, reporters and editors at major outlets were recruited as assets, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, to help plant favorable stories or quietly bury unflattering ones. The claim gained real traction in 1977 when journalist Carl Bernstein published an investigation in Rolling Stone alleging that more than 400 journalists had worked with the CIA in some capacity over the years. The Church Committee, around the same time, did confirm that the CIA maintained relationships with certain members of the press, though historians still debate how organized, centralized, or intentional this network actually was. Some researchers argue Mockingbird was a loosely coordinated reality. Others suggest the name and scale have grown larger in public memory than the declassified evidence fully supports. What remains agreed upon is simpler and perhaps just as unsettling. For a period of time, the line between American journalism and American intelligence was, at the very least, blurrier than most readers were ever told. And speaking of files that were never meant to see daylight, let's drift into the private office of J. Edgar Hoover, where he reportedly kept something far more personal than case records. J. Edgar Hoover's secret files. For nearly 50 years, Hoover ran the FBI as its first and only director, serving under 8 different presidents from Coolidge to Nixon. That kind of longevity in Washington rarely happens by accident, and historians have long wondered how one man managed to outlast so many changes in power. Part of the answer, many researchers believe, lies in a set of files Hoover kept close to himself, known informally as his official and confidential files. These weren't standard bureau records stored in some vast archive. They were personal, private, and reportedly filled with sensitive information on senators, congressmen, and even presidents themselves. Rumors swirled for decades about what exactly Hoover had collected. Details about affairs, financial improprieties, personal habits that politicians would rather have kept quiet. Whether every rumor was true is difficult to say with certainty, since so much of what Hoover kept was informal, unofficial, and deliberately kept outside normal channels of oversight. What we do know is that very few people in Washington ever dared to challenge him directly, and more than one attorney general who considered removing him quietly reconsidered. When Hoover died in 1972, his longtime secretary, Helen Gandy, spent hours alone in his office before anyone else arrived. By the time investigators got access, most of the most sensitive files were gone, destroyed according to her own account, following instructions she said Hoover had given her years earlier. What survived was scattered, and what was lost may never be fully known. It remains one of those quiet mysteries of American power, a filing cabinet that shaped decades of politics, and then simply vanished before anyone else could look inside. And speaking of moments when Washington finally did look inside its own intelligence agencies, even if decades too late, let's turn to the investigation that pulled so many of these threads together at once. The Church Committee investigations. In late 1974, a New York Times reporter named Seymour Hersh published an explosive story revealing that the CIA had been conducting illegal domestic surveillance on American citizens, activities explicitly outside its legal authority, which was only ever supposed to operate abroad. The public reaction was significant enough that the Senate decided to act. In 1975, a special committee was formed, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, tasked with investigating not just the CIA, but the FBI, the NSA, and other intelligence agencies as well. What the committee uncovered over months of hearings and thousands of pages of testimony was staggering in scope. Assassination plots against foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. Domestic surveillance programs that had monitored civil rights leaders and anti-war activists for years. The CIA's mail opening program, which had secretly read the private correspondence of American citizens. MKUltra, COINTELPRO, programs layered upon programs, many operating with little oversight and even less accountability. The Church Committee's final reports ran to 14 volumes, and they remain, even now, one of the most thorough public examinations of intelligence overreach in American history. The investigation was notably bipartisan, driven by senators from both parties who agreed, at least for that moment, that these agencies had drifted far from their intended boundaries. The fallout led to real changes: the creation of permanent Senate and House Intelligence Committees designed to provide ongoing oversight. The 1978 Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, establishing a court specifically to review government surveillance requests. Whether these reforms fully solve the underlying problems is something historians still debate quietly among themselves. But for a brief window in the 1970s, the country came remarkably close to knowing exactly what its intelligence agencies had been doing in the shadows. And speaking of operations that unraveled in the harsh light of public failure rather than quiet investigation, let's turn to a stretch of Cuban coastline that became synonymous with disaster: the Bay of Pigs invasion planning. In the late 1950s, after Fidel Castro's revolution succeeded in Cuba, the United States grew increasingly uneasy about a communist government sitting just 90 miles from Florida. Planning for an invasion actually began under President Eisenhower, though it was President Kennedy who inherited the operation shortly after taking office in 1961. The CIA had spent months secretly training a brigade of roughly 1,400 Cuban exiles at a camp in Guatemala, preparing them for an amphibious assault meant to spark a popular uprising against Castro's government. The plan called for the exile brigade to land at the Bay of Pigs, establish a foothold, and rally the Cuban population to rise up alongside them. On April 17, 1961, the invasion began. Within 3 days, it had completely fallen apart. Castro's forces were far better prepared than anticipated. Promised American air support was scaled back at the last moment, leaving the invading brigade exposed and without cover. Nearly all of the exile fighters were killed or captured, and the uprising the CIA had hoped for never materialized. President Kennedy publicly took responsibility for the failure, despite the operation having been planned well before he took office. The embarrassment was significant, damaging America's international credibility and deepening tensions with the Soviet Union at a moment when the Cold War was already dangerously tense. Some historians argue the failure directly influenced Soviet calculations the following year, contributing to the confidence that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. What began as a secret CIA operation, trained quietly in the mountains of Guatemala, ended as one of the most publicly visible failures in the agency's history, one that would shape American foreign policy toward Cuba for decades to come. And speaking of proposals that thankfully never left the drawing board, let's talk about a plan so extreme that even the Pentagon eventually shelved it: Operation Northwoods. In the early 1960s, following the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, the Joint Chiefs of Staff began looking for other ways to justify American military action against Cuba. In March of 1962, they presented President Kennedy with a proposal called Operation Northwoods. The plan called for staging fake incidents that could be blamed on Castro's government, creating a pretext for invasion. The ideas on paper were remarkable in their scope: faking terrorist attacks on American soil, blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuba, even staging the shootdown of a civilian airliner, with passenger lists secretly filled with substitute personnel rather than real travelers. The documents described creating what they called a "Remember the Maine" incident, deliberately referencing the 1898 event that helped trigger the Spanish-American War. The plan was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, and forwarded to the Secretary of Defense for approval. Kennedy, according to most historical accounts, rejected the proposal outright. Whether he was horrified by the ethics involved or simply saw it as impractical is something historians still debate, since the written records don't fully capture his private reaction. What we do know is that Lemnitzer was reassigned within the year, though officials at the time insisted this had nothing to do with the rejected plan. Operation Northwoods remained classified for decades, hidden away in Pentagon archives until 1997, when researcher James Bamford uncovered the documents while researching a book on the National Security Agency. When the plans became public, they shocked even seasoned Cold War historians. It stands today as a rare documented case of senior military officials proposing to deceive the American public and stage attacks on their own citizens purely for geopolitical purposes. The plan was never carried out. Nothing in Operation Northwoods ever happened. But the fact that it was written, formally proposed, and seriously considered at the highest levels of the military remains one of the more unsettling footnotes of the entire Cold War. And speaking of Cold War-era operations in Latin America that left lingering questions long after the fact, let's turn to a set of allegations that connected covert funding with something far darker than politics. CIA-Contra drug trafficking allegations. Throughout the 1980s, the United States supported the Contras, a rebel group fighting against Nicaragua's Sandinista government. Congress, growing uneasy about the conflict, passed the Boland Amendment, restricting direct U.S. military aid to the Contras. What followed became one of the messier chapters of that decade, as questions arose about how the Contras were being funded once official channels closed. In 1996, journalist Gary Webb published a series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News, alleging that Contra-linked networks had been involved in smuggling cocaine into the United States, with proceeds funneling back to fund the rebel movement. Webb's reporting suggested the crack cocaine epidemic that devastated many American cities in the 1980s had ties, whether direct or indirect, to this network. The claims were explosive, and they were also difficult to prove with absolute certainty. Congressional inquiries, including a lengthy investigation by the CIA's own Inspector General, followed in the years after. The findings were nuanced rather than definitive. Investigators found that certain individuals connected to the Contras had indeed been involved in drug trafficking, and that, in at least some instances, U.S. agencies had been aware of these connections without taking action to stop them, prioritizing the anti-communist mission over drug enforcement concerns. Whether the CIA actively participated in trafficking, simply looked the other way, or was unaware of the full scope, remains a matter of historical debate. Webb faced intense criticism from larger newspapers at the time, and his career suffered considerably as a result. He died in 2004, and his reporting has since been re-examined more sympathetically by journalists and historians alike. The full truth of how much official knowledge existed and how far it went is a question that still doesn't have a clean, satisfying answer. And speaking of internal reports meant to stay buried indefinitely, let's turn to a document the CIA itself created, one so sensitive that it earned a nickname suggesting just how carefully it needed to be guarded. The Family Jewels Report, in 1973, CIA Director James Schlesinger, alarmed by revelations connecting the agency to the Watergate scandal, ordered every CIA employee to report any activities that might have been illegal or outside the agency's charter. What came back filled a 500-page internal report that staff informally began calling the Family Jewels, a name suggesting these were the agency's most closely guarded and potentially damaging secrets. The report cataloged decades of questionable operations, assassination plots against foreign leaders, illegal wiretapping of American journalists, mail-opening programs targeting U.S. citizens, drug experiments connected to MKUltra, surveillance of anti-war activists and civil rights leaders. It was, in essence, a confession written by the agency about itself, compiled quietly and kept locked away from public view for decades. Portions of it leaked to the press in 1974, sparking the very investigations that led to the Church Committee hearings. But the full report itself remained classified for over 30 years. It wasn't until 2007 that the CIA finally released a substantial portion of the Family Jewels document to the public, following a request under the Freedom of Information Act. Even then, significant sections remained redacted, blacked out entirely, leaving researchers to speculate about what still couldn't be shown. Reading through what was eventually released feels almost like reading an institution's private diary, one filled with quiet admissions the agency clearly hoped would never need to be spoken aloud. It remains one of the most direct pieces of evidence historians have, not of what outsiders accused the CIA of doing, but of what the agency privately admitted to itself. And speaking of secrets the CIA kept locked away for decades, sometimes those secrets weren't documents at all, but entire ships built for a single audacious purpose: Project Azorian and the Glomar Explorer. In 1968, a Soviet submarine known as K-129 sank in the Pacific Ocean under circumstances that remain somewhat mysterious even today. It went down roughly 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii, carrying nuclear missiles, cryptographic equipment, and codebooks that American intelligence desperately wanted to examine. The Soviets searched for their lost submarine and failed to find it. The Americans, using sensitive underwater listening equipment, succeeded. What followed was one of the most expensive and elaborate covert operations in CIA history. The agency partnered with billionaire Howard Hughes to construct a massive deep-sea mining vessel called the Glomar Explorer, ostensibly designed to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor, a cover story that sounded just plausible enough to explain a ship of such unusual size and capability. In reality, the vessel was built for one purpose only: to lower a giant claw mechanism more than 3 miles down to the ocean floor and physically lift the broken submarine to the surface. The operation, launched in the summer of 1974, cost somewhere around $800 million, an almost unthinkable sum for the era. The recovery itself did not go entirely as planned. As the submarine was being lifted, a significant portion of it broke apart and sank back to the ocean floor, leaving the CIA with only a partial recovery. The front third of the vessel, along with a handful of bodies of Soviet sailors, which were later given a formal burial at sea with military honors, filmed quietly by the recovery team. What exactly the CIA managed to retrieve from that partial recovery remains classified to this day. Some accounts suggest little of real intelligence value survived. Others suggest otherwise. The full truth sits somewhere in a vault, waiting for a declassification that may never come. And speaking of expensive Cold War projects built to see what the Soviets were doing without anyone knowing we were watching, let's turn to an aircraft so revolutionary it changed the entire nature of espionage: the U-2 spy plane program. In the early 1950s, American intelligence agencies faced a frustrating problem. They needed to know what was happening deep inside Soviet territory, particularly regarding missile development and military buildup, but there was no reliable way to gather that information without risking war. The solution came from Lockheed's Skunk Works division, a secretive engineering unit that developed an aircraft capable of flying at altitudes above 70,000 feet, far higher than Soviet fighter jets or anti-aircraft weapons of the time were believed capable of reaching. The U-2 looked almost fragile, with long glider-like wings built for efficiency rather than speed, but it could soar over Soviet airspace, snapping detailed photographs of military installations, missile sites, and troop movements, all while the pilots believed themselves safely beyond reach. For several years, the program operated with remarkable success. The images gathered gave American officials a clearer picture of Soviet capabilities than almost any other source available at the time, helping to calm certain fears about a supposed missile gap that some worried was tilting dangerously in favor of the Soviets. Then in May of 1960, everything changed. A U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down deep inside Soviet territory by a surface-to-air missile that many analysts hadn't believed could reach that altitude. Powers survived, was captured, and put on trial in Moscow, creating a diplomatic embarrassment for President Eisenhower, who had initially denied the flights were happening at all, only to have the Soviets produce the wreckage and the pilot as evidence. The incident soured an already tense relationship between the two superpowers and led to the collapse of a planned summit meeting in Paris just weeks later. Powers was eventually exchanged in 1962 for a captured Soviet spy, in a swap that took place quietly on a bridge in Berlin, the kind of moment that later inspired films and novels for decades afterward. The U-2 itself remained in service for years beyond that single incident, quietly continuing surveillance work well into the modern era, a strange testament to how effective the original design truly was. And speaking of cover stories built to protect secrets that officials still won't fully confirm or deny, the Glomar Explorer left behind something almost as lasting as the submarine recovery itself, a phrase that continues to shape how the government handles uncomfortable questions to this very day. Secrecy around the Glomar Explorer. When journalists eventually began investigating the true purpose of the mysterious mining vessel funded by Howard Hughes, the CIA faced an unusual dilemma. Simply denying the story risked drawing more attention to it. Confirming any part of it risked revealing operational details the agency wanted kept hidden indefinitely. So officials developed a now famous response, one crafted specifically to avoid confirming or denying anything at all. When reporters filed requests under the Freedom of Information Act asking about the Glomar Explorer's true mission, the CIA's official reply stated that they could neither confirm nor deny the existence of records related to the matter. At first glance, it sounds almost like a dodge, a clever way of saying nothing, while appearing to answer the question directly. But the legal effect was profound. Courts eventually recognized this exact phrasing as a legitimate form of response under Freedom of Information law, one that agencies could use whenever even acknowledging the existence of certain records might itself reveal classified information. This response became so associated with the Glomar Explorer incident that it earned its own name in legal circles, the Glomar response, a term still used today by lawyers, journalists, and government agencies whenever a request touches on matters too sensitive to even confirm exist. It appears in national security cases, surveillance disputes, and intelligence-related lawsuits decades after the original ship that inspired it faded into obscurity. In a strange way, the legacy of Project Azorian isn't really the partial submarine recovery, nor the photographs, nor the classified intelligence gathered from that broken hull resting on the seafloor. Its most lasting legacy might simply be a turn of phrase, a linguistic loophole born from a single covert mission that gave the government a permanent way to answer difficult questions without technically answering them at all. Whether that phrase represents a necessary tool for protecting legitimate national security secrets, or simply a convenient shield for withholding information the public might otherwise deserve to know, remains a question historians and legal scholars continue to debate quietly among themselves, long after the ship that started it all was eventually sold for scrap. 13. The FBI's file on Martin Luther King Jr. And speaking of secrets that took decades to surface, blurred lines between protecting a nation and monitoring one of its most influential citizens. Let's turn to a file that grew thicker with every passing year of the 1960s. The FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. began not as a single decision, but as a slow accumulation of suspicion, funded by fears that shifted depending on who you asked. Attorney General Robert Kennedy authorized wiretaps on King's phones in 1963, initially citing concerns about possible communist influence within the civil rights movement, a worry that reflected the broader anxieties of the Cold War era rather than any solid proof of wrongdoing. Once the wiretaps were approved, the surveillance expanded well beyond phone lines. Hotel rooms were bugged, associates were questioned, photographs were taken, reports were filed by agents assigned specifically to track King's movements, his speeches, his private conversations, and even his personal relationships. J. Edgar Hoover, who led the Bureau for decades, viewed King as a destabilizing figure, someone whose growing influence over public opinion made him, in Hoover's mind, worth watching closely. The file that resulted from these years of monitoring eventually grew to include thousands of pages, some of which remain sealed even now, tucked away under National Archive restrictions that won't lift until well into this century. What made the surveillance particularly troubling to later historians wasn't just its scope, but its purpose. Much of it seemed less concerned with any genuine national security threat, and more focused on gathering material that could discredit King personally. Information intended not to prevent a crime, but to manage a reputation. Recordings from hotel rooms were reportedly used in an attempt to influence King's public standing, distributed quietly to journalists and even to King himself in the infamous anonymous letter that suggested he take his own life before receiving a supposed award, a moment historians still find difficult to fully explain. Whether the full weight of this campaign reflected official policy at the highest levels of government or the personal fixation of a few powerful men within the Bureau remains a matter some historians still debate. What isn't in question is that a civil rights leader advocating peacefully for equal treatment under the law spent years under a level of government scrutiny normally reserved for suspected foreign agents. The surveillance didn't stop with his assassination in 1968. Files continued to be maintained and referenced for years afterward, part of a broader program aimed at civil rights organizations that Hoover viewed with persistent unease. It's a quiet, uncomfortable footnote to a moment in American history often remembered for its optimism, a reminder that behind the marches and speeches that shaped a movement, There was another story unfolding in filing cabinets and surveillance vans, one the public wouldn't fully understand until decades later when portions of the file were finally released. 14. Elvis Presley as FBI informant. And speaking of unlikely relationships between famous cultural figures and federal law enforcement, let's turn to a moment that still surprises people whenever they first hear about it. In December of 1970, Elvis Presley showed up unannounced at the White House gates, dressed in a purple velvet suit, hoping to meet with President Nixon. He carried with him a handwritten letter expressing concern about the influence of drug culture and what he described as anti-American sentiment growing among certain segments of the youth movement, including, somewhat ironically, groups associated with the very counterculture his own music had once been credited with helping to inspire. Presley requested a meeting, and remarkably, he received one. Photographs from that Oval Office visit remain some of the most requested images in the entire National Archives, showing Presley shaking hands with Nixon, seemingly an unlikely pairing captured in a single strange, memorable frame. During their conversation, Presley reportedly offered his services as what he called a federal agent at large, expressing a desire to help monitor countercultural movements, including figures he viewed with suspicion, some accounts suggesting he mentioned the Beatles by name, whom he apparently believed had a negative influence on American youth despite, or perhaps because of their massive popularity. Nixon seemed charmed by the encounter and arranged for Presley to receive a Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge, a gesture that Presley treasured for the rest of his life, reportedly carrying it with him regularly. Whether Presley ever conducted any actual undercover work or provided meaningful information to federal agencies remains unclear, and many historians treat his offer as more symbolic than operational, an eccentric moment born from genuine, if somewhat theatrical, patriotic conviction rather than any formal arrangement. Still, the meeting reveals something curious about the era. Here was one of the most famous entertainers in the world, a man whose own rise to fame had once alarmed conservative parents and cultural commentators, now positioning himself as an ally of law enforcement against the very cultural shifts he'd once been blamed for encouraging. It's a strange little episode, easy to overlook amid the larger, more consequential stories of the decade, but it captures a peculiar cultural moment when fame, patriotism, and federal power intersected in ways nobody quite expected. 15. John Lennon's FBI surveillance file. And speaking of musicians whose relationship with federal authorities went in a very different direction, let's turn our attention to John Lennon, whose file grew for entirely different reasons than Presley's brief, friendly visit. When Lennon moved to New York City in the early 1970s, he arrived as an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War, using his considerable public platform to support anti-war demonstrations and left-leaning political causes. With a presidential election approaching and voting age recently lowered to 18, officials within the Nixon administration reportedly grew concerned that Lennon's influence over young voters could affect the outcome. The FBI opened a file on him, and over time that file expanded to include reports on his public appearances, his phone conversations, and his associations with various activist figures. Agents attended his concerts. They tracked his movements around the city. Some documents suggest surveillance teams monitored him closely enough to note which restaurants he visited and who he met with. Separately, immigration officials pursued a deportation case against Lennon, citing a prior drug conviction in England, a case Lennon and his legal team fought for several years, arguing the effort was politically motivated rather than a genuine legal concern. The surveillance and legal battle continued until Nixon's resignation in 1974 quietly ended the political pressure surrounding the case, allowing Lennon to eventually receive permanent residency in 1976. Portions of his file were released decades later, revealing the extent of the monitoring, though certain sections remain redacted even today, leaving researchers and journalists to speculate about what additional details those blacked-out passages might once have contained. It's worth noting that debates continue among historians about exactly how coordinated or centralized this effort truly was, some viewing it as a clear example of political surveillance overreach, others suggesting it reflected a more scattered, less deliberate bureaucratic response to a public figure who simply made certain officials uneasy. Either way, the file stands today as a quiet reminder of how fame and political dissent could draw the attention of federal agencies, turning a musician known for songs about peace into the subject of a surveillance campaign that lasted years longer than anyone at the time could have predicted. 16. Operation Paperclip. And speaking of secrets that shaped the decades following World War II in ways most Americans never fully understood, let's turn to a program that quietly reshaped American science, using help from some deeply troubling sources. As the war in Europe ended in 1945, American military officials realized that Germany had developed technology far ahead of anything the United States possessed, particularly in rocketry, aviation, and chemistry. Rather than let that expertise scatter to the wind or fall into Soviet hands, the US government launched a secret initiative to identify and recruit German scientists, engineers, and technicians, bringing them to America to continue their work under American supervision. The program was called Operation Paperclip, named for the small paper clips attached to the files of scientists deemed valuable enough to recruit. Over 1,600 scientists eventually made their way to the United States through this initiative, settling into research positions at universities, private companies, and government facilities. Many of them contributed directly to programs that would define the coming decades, including the space race. Wernher von Braun, perhaps the most famous name among them, had served as a leading rocket scientist for Nazi Germany, developing the V-2 rocket, a weapon that killed thousands of civilians in London and other cities during the war. Braun later became a central figure in NASA's development of the Saturn V rocket, the very vehicle that carried American astronauts to the moon. The uncomfortable truth beneath this achievement was that some of these scientists had documented ties to the Nazi Party, and a few had connections to the forced labor camps where V-2 rockets were manufactured under horrific conditions that killed more people building the weapons than the weapons themselves ever killed in combat. American officials were aware of these backgrounds. Files were reportedly sanitized or rewritten to downplay Nazi affiliations, allowing scientists to pass immigration and security screenings that might otherwise have disqualified them. The government's justification centered on Cold War logic, the idea that keeping this expertise out of Soviet hands was worth the moral compromise involved in overlooking wartime affiliations. It's a decision that historians still turn over carefully, weighing scientific advancement against accountability, national security against justice for the victims of forced labor. The full details of Operation Paperclip weren't declassified until decades later, leaving generations of Americans to admire the achievements of the space program without knowing the complicated history stitched quietly into its foundations. 17. CIA's LSD experiments on unwitting subjects. And speaking of Cold War programs built on secrecy and questionable ethics, let's drift toward one of the stranger chapters connected to the CIA's mind control research, a program that reportedly extended its reach into ordinary lives without anyone's knowledge or consent. As part of the broader MKUltra project, which explored whether the human mind could be controlled or manipulated through drugs, hypnosis, and other psychological techniques, researchers grew particularly interested in lysergic acid diethylamide, more commonly known as LSD. While some test subjects volunteered, understanding at least partially what they were participating in, other accounts describe a far more troubling practice: unsuspecting individuals dosed with the drug without their knowledge, sometimes in social settings, sometimes through food or drinks that gave no indication anything had been altered. The reasoning behind this approach centered on a simple, unsettling question: how would a person behave, think, or respond if they had no idea they'd been drugged at all? Reports describe testing conducted in safe houses set up in cities like San Francisco, where unwitting visitors were served drinks laced with LSD, while researchers observed their reactions from behind one-way mirrors, an operation sometimes referred to informally as Operation Midnight Climax. Details remain incomplete, since much of the CIA's documentation on MKUltra was destroyed in 1973 under order from then-Director Richard Helms, leaving historians to reconstruct much of the program from surviving fragments, congressional testimony, and the memories of those who came forward decades later. One case that drew significant attention involved Frank Olson, an Army scientist who died after falling from a hotel window in 1953, shortly after unknowingly being given LSD during a work retreat. His death was initially ruled a suicide, though his family has spent decades questioning that conclusion, and later government acknowledgments confirmed he had been dosed without consent, though the full circumstances surrounding his death remain a subject some researchers still debate. The Church Committee hearings in the 1970s eventually exposed portions of MKUltra to the public, revealing a program that spanned universities, hospitals, and prisons, often using people who had no idea they were part of any experiment at all. The government issued limited apologies and modest settlements to some victims and families, though many questions remain unanswered simply because so much of the paperwork no longer exists. It stands today as one of the more unsettling reminders of how far Cold War anxieties pushed those in power to test the limits of the human mind, often at the expense of the very citizens they were meant to protect. 18. Origins of the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. And speaking of programs that began with far simpler, almost accidental origins, let's ease into a much lighter piece of FBI history. One that started not with a grand strategic plan, but with a casual conversation between a journalist and the Bureau's director. In 1949, a reporter from International News Service approached J. Edgar Hoover asking for a list of the toughest, most dangerous criminals currently being sought by the FBI, hoping to put together a compelling news feature for his readers. Hoover, always attentive to opportunities that might boost the Bureau's public image, saw potential in the idea and decided to formalize it. On March 14, 1950, the FBI officially launched its 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, publishing photographs, descriptions, and details of the individuals considered the most urgent priorities for capture at that time. The list quickly captured public attention, appearing in newspapers, post offices, and later TV broadcasts, turning ordinary citizens into informal partners in nationwide manhunts. People began recognizing faces from the list in diners, gas stations, and city streets, occasionally leading directly to arrests that might never have happened otherwise. Over the decades, the list expanded beyond simple publicity, becoming a genuine tool for law enforcement, credited with helping capture hundreds of fugitives whose crimes ranged from bank robbery and organized crime to kidnapping and murder. Being named to the list carried a certain grim notoriety, a signal that someone had become significant enough or dangerous enough to warrant national attention rather than simply local pursuit. The list has evolved with the times too, eventually incorporating input from the public through tip lines, and later expanding into digital spaces where photographs and information could reach millions instantly rather than waiting for the morning paper. It's a rare example of a government program born from something as ordinary as a reporter looking for a good story, evolving quietly into an enduring piece of American law enforcement culture, one that continues today, still updated regularly, still capturing public curiosity the same way it did back in 1950, when a simple list of faces first appeared, asking ordinary people to help keep watch over their own communities. 19. Stargate Project. And speaking of government programs that stretch the boundaries of what most people would consider serious scientific inquiry, let's settle into one of the stranger corners of Cold War research, a program that asked whether the human mind might be capable of gathering intelligence without any conventional tools at all. Beginning in the 1970s and continuing in various forms into the early 1990s, the United States government funded a classified initiative that explored something called remote viewing, the idea that certain individuals might be able to perceive distant locations, hidden objects, or secret activities using only focused mental concentration. The program eventually came to be known as Stargate Project, though it operated under several different names over the years as it moved between the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and various Army research units. Millions of dollars were spent testing participants who claimed psychic sensitivity, asking them to describe military installations, submarine locations, and even the whereabouts of hostages, all while sitting quietly in a research facility with nothing more than a notepad and their own concentration. Researchers involved in the program insisted some sessions produced results that seemed uncannily accurate, details that supposedly matched real locations the viewers had no ordinary way of knowing. Skeptics within the intelligence community were far less convinced, arguing that any apparent hits were more likely the product of vague descriptions, coincidence, or the very human tendency to find meaning in random information after the fact. The program continued regardless, driven partly by fear that if remote viewing worked and the Soviets were pursuing similar research, the United States couldn't afford to be left behind in a psychic arms race that may or may not have existed anywhere, outside laboratory speculation. When Stargate Project was finally declassified in 1995, an independent review concluded that the program had produced no evidence of intelligence value significant enough to justify continued funding, and the initiative was quietly shut down. Some of the researchers and participants involved maintained for years afterward that the program's results had been unfairly dismissed, insisting the real story had never been told properly to the public. Others viewed the entire episode as a strange but understandable byproduct of Cold War paranoia, a time when no possibility, however unconventional, felt safe to ignore completely. Whatever the truth behind remote viewing itself, the fact remains that for roughly 2 decades, the American government took the question seriously enough to fund it quietly, tucked away from public view, a curious footnote in the long and often peculiar history of intelligence gathering. 20. Operation CHAOS. And speaking of intelligence agencies wandering well outside the boundaries they were originally designed to operate within, let's turn to a program that turned the CIA's attention inward, toward the very citizens it was never supposed to be watching in the first place. The CIA's charter, established when the agency was created in 1947, specifically limited its activities to foreign intelligence, explicitly prohibiting domestic surveillance or law enforcement functions within the United States. Yet by the mid-1960s, as anti-war protests grew louder and more widespread across American college campuses and city streets, officials in Washington grew increasingly convinced that foreign governments must be secretly funding and directing the unrest. Acting on this suspicion, the CIA launched Operation CHAOS in 1967, a domestic surveillance program designed to investigate whether international communist movements were behind the anti-war movement sweeping the country. Agents infiltrated peace organizations, student groups, and civil rights coalitions, compiling files on thousands of American citizens whose only apparent offense was opposing the war in Vietnam or advocating for social change. The program eventually generated files on over 7,000 individuals and cross-referenced information on hundreds of domestic organizations, all without any court oversight or legal authority permitting such activity on American soil. Despite years of surveillance, infiltration, and data collection, investigators never found meaningful evidence that foreign governments were orchestrating the anti-war movement in any significant way. What they found instead was simply what it appeared to be on the surface: American citizens exercising their right to protest a war many of them found morally indefensible. Operation CHAOS continued quietly until 1974, when investigative journalism began exposing pieces of the program to the public, prompting the Church Committee hearings that would eventually reveal the full scope of the CIA's overreach. The committee's findings confirmed that the agency had operated well beyond its legal authority for years, treating dissent as a potential threat rather than a protected right. Reforms followed, including tighter restrictions on domestic intelligence activities, though the episode left a lasting reminder of how easily fear and suspicion can quietly reshape the boundaries an agency was originally built to respect. 21. CIA plots against Fidel Castro. And speaking of operations built on determination that outpaced practicality, let's ease into one of the more curious chapters of Cold War history, a long and often bewildering effort to remove one man from power through methods that range from serious to almost cartoonish. Beginning shortly after Fidel Castro's rise to power in Cuba in 1959, the CIA began developing plans to undermine or eliminate him, driven by fears that his alliance with the Soviet Union placed a communist stronghold uncomfortably close to American shores. Over the following years, declassified documents describe a series of schemes that read less like traditional espionage and more like the plot of an eccentric spy novel. One plan reportedly involved lacing Castro's cigars with poison, hoping a simple habit might become the method of his undoing. Another proposed dusting his shoes with a chemical designed to make his beard fall out, based on the theory that Castro's public image was closely tied to his appearance, and that humiliation might undercut his authority among Cuban citizens. Yet another idea involved contaminating a diving suit intended as a gift, coating it with substances meant to cause illness or infection once worn. Reports also describe attempts to recruit organized crime figures with connections to Cuba, hoping underworld operatives might succeed where traditional intelligence methods had not. None of these plans, as far as available records show, succeeded, and several never advanced beyond the planning stages at all. The Church Committee investigations of the 1970s brought many of these schemes into public view for the first time, revealing a pattern of persistent, sometimes bizarre efforts rather than any single coordinated assassination attempt. Historians continue to debate how seriously some of the stranger plans were ever pursued, since surviving documentation is incomplete, and some accounts rely on testimony rather than hard evidence. What remains clear is that removing Castro became something of an obsession within certain corners of the American intelligence community for years, consuming resources and imagination alike, all without ever achieving its central goal: Castro remained in power until his own decision to step aside decades later, quietly outlasting every plot devised against him. 22. The Iran Contra affair. And speaking of operations that consumed the imagination of certain officials for years, let's drift into one of the most tangled scandals of the 1980s, a story involving arms sales, hostages, and a rebel army thousands of miles away in Central America. In the early 1980s, Congress grew increasingly uneasy about American involvement in Nicaragua, where a group of rebels known as the Contras were fighting against the ruling Sandinista government. Concerned about being drawn into another prolonged conflict, Congress passed a series of amendments restricting direct military aid to the Contras. For officials within the Reagan administration who believed supporting the Contras was essential to containing the spread of communism in the region, these restrictions posed a serious problem. So a small group within the National Security Council quietly developed an alternative plan. The United States would sell weapons to Iran, a country under an official arms embargo, in the hope that the sale might help secure the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon. The profits from those arms sales would then be secretly funneled to the Contras, circumventing the very restrictions Congress had just put in place. For a while, the operation moved forward quietly, coordinated by a Marine lieutenant colonel named Oliver North, working alongside a small network of intermediaries. Weapons made their way to Iran. Money made its way back through complicated channels, some of it eventually reaching the Contras in the jungles of Nicaragua. The plan might have remained hidden indefinitely if not for a plane crash in 1986, when a cargo aircraft carrying supplies to the Contras was shot down over Nicaragua, and the sole surviving crew member revealed connections tracing back to the White House. Investigators began pulling at threads that unraveled into a scandal involving multiple agencies and officials, some of whom testified that they had acted to protect the president from direct knowledge of the operation. Congressional hearings in 1987 captured national attention, with Oliver North testifying in his military uniform, insisting he believed he was serving a greater cause even if it meant working outside the boundaries Congress had established. President Reagan himself stated he was not fully aware of the details, though many questioned how such an elaborate operation could unfold so far beneath his notice. Several officials were eventually convicted of charges related to obstructing Congress or lying to investigators, though many of those convictions were later overturned or pardoned. To this day, historians continue to debate exactly how much the president knew and when he knew it, a question that remains without a fully settled answer. What is certain is that for a brief period, American foreign policy operated through a shadow channel of arms deals and secret funding entirely separate from the process the Constitution intended for such decisions. 23. CIA involvement in the 1973 Chilean coup. And speaking of operations that unfolded far from public view while officials publicly insisted otherwise, let's settle once more into South America, where a democratically elected government met a violent end with quiet encouragement from abroad. In 1970, Chile elected Salvador Allende as its president, a socialist whose policies concerned officials in Washington who worried about the spread of leftist governments during the Cold War. Declassified documents later revealed that the CIA had been instructed to prevent Allende from taking office in the first place, engaging in what internal memos referred to as efforts to promote a coup climate within Chilean society. When that initial effort failed, and Allende assumed the presidency as planned, the agency shifted its approach toward undermining his government from within, funding opposition media outlets, supporting strikes designed to destabilize the economy, and maintaining contact with military officials who expressed discontent with Allende's rule. For 3 years, Chile experienced economic turmoil, political unrest, and mounting pressure from multiple directions, some of it homegrown, some of it quietly encouraged from abroad through channels that remained hidden at the time. In September of 1973, the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, launched a coup that ended with Allende's death inside the presidential palace, officially ruled a suicide, though the circumstances remain debated by historians to this day. What followed was a military dictatorship that lasted 17 years, one marked by thousands of disappearances, widespread torture, and the suppression of political dissent on a scale that shocked much of the international community once the full details emerged. For years, American officials publicly denied any direct role in the coup itself, describing the CIA's involvement as limited to supporting democratic institutions and countering foreign influence. It wasn't until the release of declassified documents decades later, along with the findings of the Church Committee in the 1970s, that the extent of American involvement became clearer, revealing a pattern of covert funding and coordination aimed at destabilizing a government the United States viewed as a threat. Some historians argue the CIA's involvement was decisive in enabling the coup, while others suggest Chile's internal political divisions were severe enough that unrest may have unfolded regardless of outside interference. What remains widely acknowledged and confirmed through official documentation is that the United States actively worked to undermine a democratically elected government, a fact the State Department itself formally acknowledged in later years, offering a rare and quiet admission of a chapter many would have preferred to leave in shadow. 24. The FBI's handling of the Waco siege, and speaking of standoffs that ended in tragedy after choices made under pressure. Let's turn now to a quiet compound in Texas, where a religious community and federal agents found themselves locked in a confrontation that captivated the nation for nearly 2 months. In February of 1993, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms attempted to execute a search warrant at a property near Waco, Texas, belonging to a religious group known as the Branch Davidians, led by a man named David Koresh. The group was suspected of stockpiling illegal weapons, and the initial raid quickly turned violent, resulting in the deaths of several agents and Branch Davidian members within the opening minutes. What followed was a 51-day standoff as the FBI took over command of the scene, surrounding the compound and attempting to negotiate the peaceful surrender of those inside, including dozens of men, women, and children who remained with Koresh throughout the ordeal. Negotiations stretched on for weeks, marked by moments of cautious progress followed by renewed tension. As federal agents grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of resolution, loud music and bright lights were used through the nights in an effort to psychologically pressure those inside into surrendering, a tactic that many later questioned as counterproductive, given how deeply the group already distrusted the government surrounding them. On April 19, 1993, the FBI launched a final assault, using armored vehicles to inject tear gas into the compound in hopes of forcing everyone out. Instead, a fire broke out, spreading rapidly through the wooden structure, and within hours the compound had burned to the ground. 76 people died in the fire, including more than 20 children, along with Koresh himself. The exact cause of the fire remains disputed to this day. Government investigators concluded that Branch Davidian members started the fire themselves, a finding supported by audio recordings and forensic analysis conducted afterward. Some survivors and independent researchers have questioned that conclusion, suggesting the tear gas or actions taken by agents outside may have contributed to conditions that allowed the fire to spread as quickly as it did. Congressional hearings followed, examining whether the FBI's tactics escalated tensions rather than easing them, and whether alternative approaches might have led to a peaceful resolution instead of tragedy. The events at Waco left a lasting mark on public perception of federal law enforcement, influencing debates about government power that continued for years afterward. Whatever the full truth behind those final hours may be, the loss of so many lives, particularly the children who never had a choice in the matter, remains one of the most sobering chapters in the FBI's long and complicated history. 25. The Ruby Ridge Standoff. And speaking of confrontations between armed citizens and federal agents that ended in tragedy no one could take back, let's travel north to the mountains of Idaho, where a family's isolation from society collided with a federal investigation in the summer of 1992. Randy Weaver was a former factory worker who had moved his wife and children to a remote cabin near Ruby Ridge, drawn by religious beliefs and a desire to separate from what he saw as a corrupt outside world. Federal agents had been investigating Weaver after he sold 2 illegally sawed-off shotguns to an informant, and when he failed to appear in court on the resulting charges, the U.S. Marshals Service began surveillance of his property, hoping to arrest him quietly. In August of that year, a confrontation broke out between Marshals and Weaver's family that left a deputy marshal and Weaver's 14-year-old son dead. The following day, an FBI hostage rescue team sniper, operating under rules of engagement that were later heavily criticized, fired at Weaver's cabin and killed his wife, Vicky, as she stood in the doorway holding their infant daughter. She had not been named in any warrant. She was not a suspect. Her death, more than any other detail of the standoff, transformed Ruby Ridge from a regional news story into a symbol that many Americans pointed to when questioning how far federal agents could go in the name of law enforcement. The siege continued for 11 days after her death, ending only when negotiators, including a civilian volunteer, convinced Weaver to surrender peacefully. In the aftermath, Weaver was acquitted of the most serious charges against him, and a Senate subcommittee investigation concluded that the rules of engagement used by the FBI that day had violated constitutional protections. The government eventually settled with the Weaver family for over $3 million, a quiet acknowledgement that something had gone deeply wrong, even without a formal admission of guilt. The FBI's own internal reviews led to changes in how hostage rescue teams were authorized to use deadly force, changes that some argue came only because the public outrage left no other option. Ruby Ridge, along with the Waco siege that followed only months later, became a defining moment in how many Americans viewed federal law enforcement for the rest of that decade. A quiet mountain standoff that ended 2 lives and reshaped policy from the inside out, long after the cameras had gone home. 26. Whitey Bulger's FBI informant scandal. And speaking of federal agencies whose choices allowed harm to continue far longer than it should have, let's travel to Boston, where a partnership between a mob boss and the FBI blurred the line between law enforcement and complicity for nearly 2 decades. James Whitey Bulger led the Winter Hill Gang, a criminal organization responsible for extortion, drug trafficking, and murder throughout the city's underworld. In the 1970s, Bulger became an informant for the FBI, feeding agents information about a rival organized crime family, the Italian Mafia, which the Bureau considered a higher priority target. In exchange, certain agents within the Boston field office shielded Bulger from prosecution, tipped him off about pending investigations, and allowed his own criminal empire to expand largely unchecked. The relationship was managed primarily through an FBI agent named John Connolly, who had known Bulger since childhood and who investigators later determined had crossed far beyond the boundaries of a normal informant-handler relationship. While Bulger fed the Bureau selective information, he continued running rackets, ordering killings, and eliminating anyone who threatened his operation, confident that his FBI ties made him untouchable. At least 19 murders have been linked to Bulger during the years he operated as a protected informant, including individuals killed specifically because they posed a risk of exposing his arrangement with federal agents. When the relationship finally came under scrutiny in the 1990s, Bulger fled Boston just before his indictment, reportedly tipped off by Connolly himself, and remained a fugitive for 16 years, landing a place on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, the very agency that had once protected him now hunting him across the country. He was finally captured in Santa Monica, California, in 2011, living quietly under an alias with his longtime partner. Connolly was later convicted of racketeering and, in a separate case, second-degree murder for his role in facilitating one of Bulger's killings. Bulger himself was convicted in 2013 on numerous charges, including participation in 11 murders, and was sentenced to 2 life terms. He was killed in prison in 2018, under circumstances that remain the subject of ongoing questions. The case remains one of the clearest examples of how an informant relationship meant to serve justice instead enabled violence to continue for years under the protection of the very institution meant to stop it. 27. FBI's use of national security letters. And speaking of tools that allow information to be gathered quietly, without the usual checks most Americans assume protect their privacy, let's turn to a legal instrument that has drawn scrutiny for decades, the National Security Letter. Unlike a traditional subpoena, which typically requires approval from a judge, a national security letter allows the FBI to compel banks, phone companies, internet providers, and other institutions to hand over customer records without ever appearing before a court. The letters can request financial records, phone logs, and subscriber information, all under the justification of national security investigations, and for years they came bundled with something called a gag order, a provision preventing the recipient from ever telling the person involved, or in some cases anyone at all, that the request had even occurred. The authority expanded significantly after the September 11th attacks, when the Patriot Act broadened who could request the letters and what kind of information could be gathered under their authority. In the years that followed, the FBI issued tens of thousands of these letters annually, a volume that alarmed civil liberties advocates who questioned how an investigative tool requiring no judicial oversight could be used with so little transparency. A 2007 report from the Department of Justice's own Inspector General found that the FBI had misused national security letters in numerous cases, sometimes requesting information without proper justification, and at times failing to accurately report how many letters had even been issued. Legal challenges followed, with several courts ruling that the indefinite gag orders attached to the letters likely violated First Amendment protections, since recipients had no meaningful way to challenge or even discuss the requests made of them. Some reforms followed, including limited rights for recipients to challenge gag orders after a certain period, though critics argue the changes did little to address the core issue, an investigative tool that operates almost entirely outside the traditional court system. To this day, the exact scope of how national security letters are used remains difficult to measure from the outside, since much of the process unfolds by design in silence, a quiet reminder that some of the most far-reaching surveillance tools available to federal agencies were never designed to pass through the courtroom doors most Americans assume stand between their private information and the government's reach. 28. CIA's Operation Ajax in Iran. And speaking of tools that operate quietly, without much oversight, let's drift back further in time to 1953, to a much larger operation that reshaped an entire nation. In Iran, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had become a controversial figure after his government moved to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, an industry that had long been controlled by British interests. Britain, alarmed at the loss of control over such a valuable resource, appealed to the United States for help, framing Mossadegh's government as vulnerable to communist influence during a period when Cold War anxieties shaped almost every foreign policy decision in Washington. The CIA, working alongside British intelligence, supported an effort known as Operation Ajax, a covert campaign involving propaganda, bribery, and coordination with sympathetic military officers inside Iran. The plan encouraged street protests, funded opposition voices, and worked to convince the Shah, Iran's monarch, to dismiss Mossadegh from power. After an initial attempt faltered, a second wave of unrest, quietly encouraged by outside support, succeeded in removing Mossadegh from office within days. The Shah, who had briefly fled the country amid the chaos, returned to a position of much stronger authority, ruling for the next 26 years with increasing reliance on his intelligence services to maintain control. For decades, American officials publicly downplayed the CIA's involvement, describing events in Iran as a spontaneous uprising against an unstable government. It wasn't until 2013, when the CIA itself released internal documents acknowledging its role, that the agency officially confirmed what historians had suspected for a very long time. Even now, the full extent of the operation's influence, versus the genuine domestic opposition that existed against Mossadegh, remains something historians continue to debate, a reminder that history rarely offers a single tidy explanation. What isn't up for debate is the long shadow the episode cast. Resentment toward foreign interference became deeply embedded in Iranian political memory, a sentiment many historians point to as one thread among several that contributed to the revolution of 1979, when the Shah was finally overthrown for good. A quiet operation in the deserts and boulevards of Tehran, born from oil disputes and Cold War fears, would echo through the region for generations, a slow-moving consequence that no one in 1953 could have fully imagined unfolding. 29. CIA's Operation Paperclip in Guatemala. And speaking of operations where economic interests and Cold War fears blurred together into something far larger than anyone anticipated, let's travel south to Guatemala, just 1 year after events in Iran had quietly concluded. President Jacobo Arbenz had been democratically elected in 1950, and his government pursued a sweeping land reform program aimed at redistributing unused farmland to Guatemala's largely impoverished rural population. Much of that unused land, however, belonged to the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with significant political connections in Washington. Officials within the Eisenhower administration expressed concern that Arbenz's policies, along with his tolerance of Guatemala's small Communist Party, signaled a drift toward Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. In response, the CIA developed Operation Paperclip, a covert campaign involving propaganda broadcasts, psychological operations, and support for a coalition of Guatemalan military officers willing to move against the government. A small mercenary force, trained and equipped with CIA assistance, crossed into Guatemala in 1954, while radio broadcasts falsely suggested a much larger invasion was underway, a tactic designed to create the impression of overwhelming force rather than rely on it directly. Faced with mounting pressure and uncertain of his military's loyalty, Arbenz resigned within weeks, and a new government aligned with American interests took power shortly afterward. What followed was decades of political instability as a series of military governments struggled to maintain control, eventually giving way to a civil war lasting from 1960 until 1996, a conflict historians estimate cost approximately 200,000 lives, with United Nations investigations later attributing the vast majority of documented human rights violations to state security forces. Whether the operation was primarily driven by genuine security concerns, corporate interests, or some combination, the two remains a subject of historical discussion, and declassified CIA documents released decades later confirmed the agency's direct role in planning and executing the coup. For the people of Guatemala, the immediate Cold War calculations made in Washington translated into generations of upheaval, a distant decision with consequences that unfolded far longer and far more painfully than anyone briefing the president in 1954 likely anticipated. 30. The FBI's Palmer raids. And speaking of moments when fear of foreign ideology led federal agencies to act with sweeping, sometimes indiscriminate force, let's travel back to the earliest days of the modern FBI, long before Hoover became its famous director. In the years following World War I, the United States experienced what historians now call the First Red Scare, a period of intense anxiety following the Russian Revolution, fueled by a wave of anarchist bombings, including one that damaged the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer himself in 1919. In response, Palmer authorized a series of sweeping raids targeting suspected radicals, anarchists, and labor organizers, many of whom were immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. A young Justice Department official named J. Edgar Hoover, only in his 20s at the time, helped coordinate much of the effort, compiling lists and organizing the operations that would later be known as the Palmer Raids. Between late 1919 and early 1920, thousands of people were arrested, often without warrants, based on little more than their political affiliations, native language, or membership in labor organizations. Many detainees were held for weeks without formal charges, and several hundred immigrants were ultimately deported without full legal proceedings, based on ties to organizations the government considered dangerous. The raids drew sharp criticism even at the time, with a group of prominent legal scholars and lawyers publishing a report accusing the Justice Department of violating basic constitutional protections. Public outrage eventually cooled the campaign, and Palmer's political career suffered as predictions of a nationwide radical uprising, which he had confidently promised, failed to materialize. The episode left a lasting mark on American civil liberties history, contributing directly to the founding of the American Civil Liberties Union, an organization created specifically in response to concerns raised by the raids. For Hoover, the experience proved formative, shaping the investigative instincts and organizational habits he would carry into his decades leading the FBI. Historians continue to debate how much of the panic reflected genuine security threats versus a broader climate of fear toward immigrants and political dissidents, but the raids remain one of the clearest early examples of a federal agency moving quickly and broadly under the pressure of public anxiety, a pattern that would echo through American history for decades to come. 31. The Gary Powers U-2 incident, and speaking of fear-shaping decisions at the federal level, let's move forward a few decades to a quiet morning in May of 1960, high above the Ural Mountains, where a single aircraft would soon become the center of an international crisis. Francis Gary Powers was a pilot for the CIA, flying a U-2 spy plane on a reconnaissance mission deep into Soviet airspace, one of many such flights conducted since the mid-1950s to photograph military installations from altitudes the Soviets were believed unable to reach. The program had operated with a quiet confidence that these planes, flying at nearly 70,000 feet, were simply beyond the range of Soviet air defenses. On this particular flight, that confidence proved mistaken. A surface-to-air missile struck Powers' aircraft, forcing him to eject over Soviet territory, where he was captured almost immediately by local authorities. The initial American response followed a script prepared for exactly this kind of contingency. NASA issued a statement claiming a weather research plane had gone missing near Turkey, and officials publicly suggested the pilot may have blacked out from oxygen failure, drifting off course. It was a carefully worded story, designed to preserve deniability in case the plane or the pilot hadn't survived. The trouble was both had. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev waited patiently, allowing American officials to repeat their weather plane story publicly before revealing that Powers was alive, in custody, and had already confessed to the nature of his mission. The wreckage of the plane, largely intact, was put on public display in Moscow, along with photographic equipment that left little room for alternate explanations. President Eisenhower was placed in the uncomfortable position of having been caught in a fabrication on the world stage, and a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in Paris collapsed within days, as the Soviet leader demanded an apology that never came. Powers was put on trial in Moscow, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 10 years, though he would serve less than 2 before being exchanged in 1962 for a captured Soviet intelligence officer, in a prisoner swap conducted quietly on a bridge connecting West Berlin to East Germany. Upon his return home, Powers faced a period of public suspicion, with some officials questioning why he hadn't used a device built into the plane to destroy sensitive equipment, or why he hadn't chosen the alternative many assumed was expected of him in such situations. A CIA review later concluded he had followed his orders appropriately, a vindication that came only after years of quiet doubt trailing him. The incident marked one of the earliest and most public collisions between Cold War secrecy and the simple, unpredictable reality that spy planes might occasionally be shot down by the very people they were sent to observe. 32. FBI's investigation of MLK's assassination. And speaking of moments when secrecy and public scrutiny collided under enormous pressure, let's turn to April of 1968 and the days following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee. The FBI, an agency that had spent years surveilling King, tapping his phones and compiling files intended to discredit him, was now tasked with leading the manhunt for whoever had killed him. It was a strange and uncomfortable position for the Bureau to occupy, hunting a killer for a man they had so recently viewed as a threat to be managed, rather than a leader to be protected. The investigation, known internally as Merkin, short for Murder of King, became one of the largest manhunts in FBI history, involving thousands of agents and an enormous volume of forensic work tracing a rifle, a fingerprint, and a set of scattered personal belongings left near the boarding house from which the fatal shot had been fired. Investigators eventually connected the evidence to James Earl Ray, an escaped convict who had been using a series of aliases while moving through Canada, England, and Portugal in the weeks following the assassination. Ray was ultimately captured at Heathrow Airport in London, extradited to the United States, and pled guilty in 1969, avoiding a trial and receiving a sentence of 99 years. He would later attempt to withdraw his guilty plea, claiming he had been part of a larger conspiracy involving a man he referred to only as Raoul, a claim he maintained until his death in 1998. Whether Ray acted entirely alone, or whether others played some role in planning or assisting the assassination, remains a question historians and King's own family have approached differently over the years, with a 1999 civil trial in Memphis reaching a conclusion that differed from the criminal case, though its findings remain a subject of ongoing discussion rather than settled consensus. What is not disputed is the discomfort many observers felt watching an agency that had worked so hard to undermine King in life suddenly positioned as the primary investigator determining the truth of his death, a irony that has followed the case for more than 5 decades. 33. CIA's Phoenix program in Vietnam. And speaking of operations where the line between necessary wartime strategy and something far more troubling became difficult to locate, let's turn to Vietnam and a CIA-supported initiative launched in 1967 known as the Phoenix program. The stated purpose was straightforward enough on paper: to identify and dismantle the Viet Cong's political infrastructure operating quietly within South Vietnamese villages. The network of local organizers, tax collectors, and informants that allowed the insurgency to function even in areas without a visible military presence. In practice, the program relied heavily on intelligence, gathered from local South Vietnamese forces, interrogations, and informant networks, coordinating information across military and civilian agencies in an effort neither side had previously managed with much success. Tens of thousands of suspected Viet Cong operatives were captured, and the program is credited by some military historians with meaningfully disrupting the insurgency's ability to organize in contested regions. But the program's methods drew serious and lasting criticism. Testimony before Congress in 1971 described interrogation practices that included torture, and credible allegations emerged of assassinations carried out against individuals whose actual involvement with the Viet Cong was, at best, uncertain. Estimates of how many people were killed under the program vary considerably, ranging from around 20,000 to more than 40,000, a wide margin that reflects how difficult it has been to separate confirmed insurgents from villagers caught up in a system with limited oversight and enormous pressure to produce results. William Colby, who oversaw the program and later became CIA director, defended it publicly as a legitimate intelligence effort, while acknowledging that abuses had occurred at the local level, carried out largely by South Vietnamese forces operating with limited direct American supervision. Critics have long argued the program's quota-driven structure created incentives for exaggeration and abuse, though defenders maintain it targeted a genuine and dangerous shadow government rather than random civilians. Decades later, the Phoenix program remains a difficult case study, cited by military strategists studying counterinsurgency and by human rights historians studying the costs of programs where results are measured in numbers rather than certainty, a quiet reminder that the space between military necessity and moral compromise doesn't always announce itself clearly at the time. 34. The Amerithrax investigation, and speaking of programs where the search for certainty proved far more elusive than anyone expected, let's turn to the autumn of 2001, just weeks after the September 11th attacks, when a new kind of fear began arriving through the mail. Letters containing a fine weaponized powder of anthrax spores were sent to news organizations and 2 United States senators, killing 5 people and sickening 17 others, in a wave of anxiety that swept across a country already on edge. The FBI's investigation, which came to be known as Amerithrax, would stretch on for nearly 7 years, becoming one of the most complex and resource-intensive inquiries in the Bureau's history. Investigators initially focused their attention on a scientist named Stephen Hatfill, a former Army biodefense researcher who found himself publicly named as a person of interest. His life and career upended by intense media scrutiny before he was ultimately cleared entirely, later receiving a settlement from the government for the damage done to his reputation. The investigation eventually turned toward another researcher, Bruce Ivins, who had worked for years at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick, handling the very strain of anthrax used in the attacks. As pressure mounted and investigators prepared to bring charges, Ivins died by suicide in the summer of 2008, and shortly afterward the FBI formally named him as the sole perpetrator, closing the case without the benefit of a trial. Many scientists and colleagues who had worked alongside Ivins found the conclusion difficult to accept, pointing to gaps in the physical evidence and questioning whether the case against him would have withstood the scrutiny of a courtroom. A National Academy of Sciences review later found that the scientific evidence linking Ivins to the anthrax was not as conclusive as the FBI had suggested, raising questions that remain unresolved even now. Whether Ivins acted entirely alone, whether he acted at all, or whether some piece of this story still lies beyond what investigators were able to confirm, remains an open question for those who have studied the case closely, a quiet reminder that even a 7-year investigation doesn't always arrive at an answer everyone can rest easy with. 35. FBI's historical wiretapping practices, and speaking of investigations that left more questions than comfortable answers, let's rewind a bit further to consider a practice that quietly shaped the Bureau's relationship with the American public for much of the 20th century: wiretapping. For decades, the FBI operated with remarkably wide latitude to listen in on phone conversations, often targeting politicians, journalists, and civil rights figures under the broad justification of national security. Director J. Edgar Hoover, who led the Bureau for nearly 50 years, was known to personally review transcripts of conversations involving public figures, using the information gathered not just for investigations, but reportedly to maintain leverage over officials in Washington, a practice that has been described by historians as blurring the line between law enforcement and personal influence. These wiretaps often operated without judicial warrants, relying instead on internal authorizations that left little room for outside oversight. It wasn't until the Church Committee hearings in the mid-1970s that the full scope of these practices came into public view, revealing just how routinely the Bureau had listened in on Americans who posed no clear threat to anyone, aside from disagreeing publicly with those in power. The revelations prompted significant legal reform, most notably the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which established a dedicated court intended to review and approve surveillance requests, adding a layer of oversight that had simply not existed before. Supporters of the reforms argued they were long overdue, a necessary check on an agency that had operated with too little accountability for too long. Others have noted that the new system, while an improvement, still relied on a secret court whose proceedings the public would never see, leaving some of the same questions about oversight unresolved in a new form. Either way, the wiretapping practices of the Hoover era stand as a quiet lesson in how easily surveillance tools, once created, tend to expand beyond their original purpose, a pattern that would echo again in the decades that followed. 36. CIA's Project MKUltra. And speaking of programs built quietly in the shadow of larger, better-known operations, let's turn to a lesser-discussed initiative that ran alongside the CIA's infamous MKUltra program, one known as MKUltra. Where MKUltra focused on mind control and behavioral experimentation, MKUltra concerned itself with something more physical: the study, storage, and potential use of biological materials and toxins for covert operations. Operated jointly with the Army's biological laboratories at Fort Detrick, the program maintained a stockpile of lethal substances, including shellfish toxin and cobra venom, reportedly intended for use in assassination devices small enough to leave little trace behind. Some of these materials were said to be developed for delivery through ordinary-looking objects: a poison dart disguised as something harmless, a chemical designed to cause death that might be mistaken for natural causes. The program operated in near total secrecy for years, existing outside the knowledge of most CIA personnel, let alone the public or Congress. It came to light in 1975, during the Church Committee's broader investigation into CIA activities, when officials discovered that the agency had continued stockpiling these materials even after President Nixon had ordered biological weapons programs dismantled years earlier. The CIA's own director at the time expressed surprise at the discovery, suggesting that even leadership within the agency had lost track of exactly what MKUltra had produced or retained. The revelation raised uncomfortable questions about how a program built around lethal toxins could continue operating quietly for so long without triggering the oversight that might have caught it sooner. Some materials were ordered destroyed once the program became public, though records suggest not everything was accounted for in the process. Whether every vial and sample was truly eliminated, or whether some portion of MKUltra's work simply faded from official record without ever being fully resolved, remains a question historians studying the program have never been able to answer with complete confidence, a quiet footnote to an already unsettling chapter of Cold War history. 37. Operation Gladio in Europe. And speaking of programs that stayed hidden for decades before anyone outside a small circle of officials knew they existed, let's cross the Atlantic and talk about something called Operation Gladio. In the years following World War II, as the Iron Curtain settled across Europe, NATO and several allied intelligence agencies reportedly began organizing what were known as stay-behind networks, groups of civilians quietly trained and equipped to resist a Soviet invasion should one ever come. The idea, at least on paper, was straightforward enough. If Soviet tanks ever rolled across Western Europe, these networks would already be in place, hidden caches of weapons buried in forests and farmland, radios stashed in basements, ordinary citizens secretly trained in sabotage and guerrilla tactics, ready to resist an occupation from within. Italy's network, the one that would eventually give the whole operation its name, was called Gladio, and it operated for decades under the coordination of Italian intelligence and, according to later investigations, with CIA involvement and funding. For years, the existence of these networks was known to only a small number of officials in each country, kept separate from regular parliamentary oversight and even from most of the military chain of command. The public had no idea any of this existed until 1990, when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti stood before Parliament and confirmed that Gladio was real, that it had operated in Italy since the early 1950s, and that similar networks had existed across nearly every NATO country in Europe. The confirmation sent a shockwave through Italian politics, in part because of lingering suspicions, never fully proven, that some stay-behind personnel or affiliated individuals may have had connections to a string of unexplained bombings and political violence in Italy during the 1960s and 70s, a period so tense and unresolved it's still referred to as the Years of Lead. Whether the networks themselves were ever actually involved in domestic terrorism, or whether that suspicion says more about the atmosphere of distrust the secrecy created, remains a genuinely open question, one that Italian courts and journalists have chased for decades without ever reaching a tidy conclusion. What is clear is that similar networks existed in Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, and several other countries, each with its own name and its own quiet history that only came to light gradually as archives opened and former operatives began speaking, sometimes decades after the fact. Some governments were more forthcoming than others. Some records were reportedly destroyed before anyone could review them. The Cold War, it turns out, left behind far more buried infrastructure than most people ever realized. Some of it literal, buried weapons in the ground, and some of it simply buried in the paperwork of agencies that preferred not to explain themselves. 38. COINTELPRO targeting the Black Panther Party, and speaking of quiet infrastructure built to counter threats that may or may not have been as large as officials believed. Let's return to American soil and talk about how the FBI's COINTELPRO program turned its attention toward the Black Panther Party. Founded in Oakland in 1966, the Black Panther Party organized community programs, including free breakfast initiatives for children and neighborhood health clinics, alongside a more confrontational political posture that unsettled many in law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover reportedly described the Panthers as one of the greatest threats to the internal security of the country, a striking assessment for an organization that, at its peak, numbered only a few thousand members nationwide. Under COINTELPRO, the FBI directed considerable resources toward monitoring the Panthers, infiltrating their meetings with informants, intercepting their communications, and working to sow division within the organization's leadership through forged letters designed to make members suspect one another of disloyalty or betrayal. Field offices across the country coordinated efforts to discredit the Panthers publicly, feeding negative stories to sympathetic media contacts and working alongside local police departments in ways that blurred the line between federal monitoring and local law enforcement action. The most devastating example of this cooperation came in December of 1969, when Chicago police, acting on detailed information from an FBI informant embedded within the local chapter, raided the apartment of Panther leader Fred Hampton in the early morning hours. Hampton was killed in the raid, along with fellow member Mark Clark, in circumstances that a later civil lawsuit determined involved wildly disproportionate gunfire from police, and evidence suggested that the informant had provided a detailed floor plan of the apartment beforehand, including the location of Hampton's bed. The families of Hampton and Clark eventually reached a settlement with the city of Chicago, Cook County, and the federal government, though many involved always felt the settlement answered financial questions far more than it answered the deeper ones about coordination and intent. The FBI's own internal memos from the era described goals that went beyond simple surveillance, aiming explicitly to prevent the rise of what one document called a Black Messiah, someone capable of unifying disparate movements into something larger. Whether that language reflected genuine strategic concern, or something closer to preemptive suppression of a movement the Bureau simply didn't want to see succeed is a question historians continue to debate, one that the declassified files illuminate without ever fully settling. 39. The CIA's classified black budget. And speaking of resources devoted to programs the public was never meant to fully understand, let's talk about money, specifically the portion of it that simply disappears from view once it reaches the intelligence community. Each year, the United States government spends tens of billions of dollars on intelligence operations, a figure that includes the CIA, the NSA, and more than a dozen other agencies collectively known as the intelligence community. And each year, a substantial portion of that spending is folded into what's often called the black budget, funding that exists, that gets spent, that pays for real personnel and real operations, but that never appears as a distinct itemized line in any public federal budget document. Congress does receive classified briefings on these figures, and select committees are tasked with providing oversight, but the details available to the general public amount to little more than a single combined total figure released periodically, with essentially nothing describing what that money actually funds. This arrangement traces back to the earliest days of the CIA itself, when the National Security Act of 1947 established the agency with language broad enough to allow its budget to be hidden within the budgets of other departments entirely, a practice that continued quietly for decades before anyone outside government ever had confirmation it was happening. It wasn't until 2013, when documents leaked by Edward Snowden included a detailed breakdown of the black budget, that the American public got its first real look at the scale and structure of this spending, revealing tens of billions allocated across categories with names deliberately vague enough to reveal little, categories covering everything from data collection to covert action programs whose specifics remained entirely redacted. The leak confirmed what many had suspected for years, that a sprawling, well-funded apparatus operated with a level of financial secrecy unmatched by nearly any other part of the federal government, accountable to a small number of congressional overseers rather than to the public whose tax dollars funded it. Defenders of the system argue that this secrecy is simply the cost of effective intelligence work, that adversaries would gain valuable insight from knowing exactly where resources are being directed. Critics counter that a democracy functions best when its citizens have at least some sense of how their government spends its money, even in matters of national security. Somewhere between those two positions sits the black budget itself, quietly funding operations the public may never fully understand. A financial fog that has settled over American intelligence spending for more than 70 years and shows little sign of lifting anytime soon. 40. CIA's historical ties to Manuel Noriega. And speaking of financial arrangements that governments would rather not discuss in detail, let's talk about a man who spent years on the CIA's payroll before becoming one of America's most publicized military targets. Manuel Noriega rose through the ranks of Panama's military and intelligence services during the 1960s and 70s, and according to declassified documents and later congressional testimony, he began providing information to American intelligence agencies as early as 1967, continuing that relationship in various forms for roughly 2 decades. Reports suggest Noriega was paid at times for the information he provided, sharing details about regional politics, drug trafficking routes, and the activities of other governments across Central America, a region where the United States had deep and often complicated interests throughout the Cold War. During this same period, Noriega was also reportedly involved in trafficking cocaine through Panama, allegedly working with Colombian cartels while simultaneously maintaining his relationship with American intelligence, an overlap that later congressional investigations found deeply troubling once it came to light. For years, Noriega's usefulness as an intelligence asset appears to have outweighed concerns about his other activities, at least from the perspective of the officials who continued the relationship. He eventually became Panama's de facto military ruler in 1983, consolidating power while maintaining those same connections to Washington. But by the late 1980s, the relationship had soured considerably. Noriega was indicted by federal grand juries in Florida on drug trafficking charges, and tensions between his government and the United States escalated sharply. In December of 1989, President George H.W. Bush ordered a full-scale military invasion of Panama, an operation known as Operation Just Cause, involving tens of thousands of American troops. Noriega took refuge in the Vatican's diplomatic mission in Panama City, where American forces famously blasted loud rock music outside the building for days in an effort to pressure him into surrendering. He eventually did, was brought to the United States, tried and convicted on drug trafficking charges, spending years in an American federal prison. The strange arc of his story, from paid informant to indicted trafficker to prisoner of the same government that once employed him, raises questions historians still debate today. How much did officials know about his other activities while he was providing useful information? Was the relationship a case of looking the other way for the sake of intelligence gains, or simply a slow accumulation of decisions made without anyone fully connecting the dots until it was too late? The declassified record offers pieces of an answer, but not a complete one, and Noriega himself, until his death in 2017, offered his own version of events, one that understandably framed his cooperation with the United States in a far more sympathetic light than the government's own files ever did. 41. FBI's investigation of the Symbionese Liberation Army, and speaking of complicated relationships between American authorities and the people they were tasked with tracking, let's talk about one of the strangest kidnapping cases in American history. In February of 1974, a small militant group calling itself the Symbionese Liberation Army kidnapped Patty Hearst, granddaughter of publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, from her apartment in Berkeley, California. The group, which had formed only a year earlier and numbered no more than a dozen members at its peak, held radical anti-establishment views and had already claimed responsibility for the assassination of a local school superintendent before turning to kidnapping as a tactic. What followed captured the attention of the entire country and kept the FBI occupied for years. Weeks after her abduction, Hearst appeared in recorded messages announcing that she had joined her captors, adopting the name Tanya, and expressing support for their cause. Security footage later showed her participating in a bank robbery alongside SLA members, an image that would become one of the most reproduced photographs of the decade. The FBI launched an enormous manhunt, one of the largest in the Bureau's history at that point, chasing leads across California as the SLA moved between hideouts, evading capture for over a year. The investigation eventually led to a dramatic and deadly confrontation in Los Angeles in May of 1974, when police surrounded a house where several SLA members were hiding. The standoff ended with a fire that killed 6 members of the group, an event broadcast live on television to a stunned national audience. Hearst herself remained at large for another year and a half before finally being captured in September of 1975. Her subsequent trial became a national spectacle, centered on a question that divided public opinion sharply. Had she genuinely converted to the SLA's cause, or was she a victim of psychological coercion, deprived of food, threatened with death, and manipulated into compliance by captors who controlled every aspect of her existence? Her defense argued the latter, drawing on emerging understanding of what would later become popularly known as Stockholm Syndrome. The jury ultimately convicted her of bank robbery, and she served nearly 2 years in prison before her sentence was commuted by President Carter. She received a full pardon years later from President Clinton. The case left behind lingering questions about coercion, culpability, and how the justice system should handle victims who become, at least outwardly, participants in the crimes committed against them, questions that still surface whenever similar cases emerge decades later. 42. FBI's secret files on U.S. presidents. And speaking of files that reveal just how far surveillance efforts sometimes reached, let's talk about something that might be hard to believe if the documentation weren't so extensive. J. Edgar Hoover led the FBI for nearly 50 years, serving under 8 different presidents, and throughout that remarkably long tenure, he reportedly maintained confidential files containing personal and political information on many of the very men who were technically his bosses. According to numerous historians and journalists who have examined declassified records and conducted extensive interviews with former officials, Hoover's files went well beyond routine background information, sometimes touching on personal indiscretions, private conversations, and political vulnerabilities that presidents would have preferred stayed hidden entirely. The exact contents of many of these files remain uncertain, since Hoover's personal secretary reportedly destroyed a significant portion of his most sensitive records shortly after his death in 1972, a detail that has fueled decades of speculation about what exactly was lost. What survives suggests a pattern of information gathering that extended well beyond Hoover's official mandate, touching figures across the political spectrum without much apparent concern for party affiliation. Some historians argue that this reputation for holding damaging information, whether entirely accurate or partly exaggerated, helps explain why Hoover remained in his position for so long despite periodic calls for his removal, since few presidents seemed eager to test what he might know or how he might use it. Whether Hoover ever explicitly used this information to influence presidential decisions remains a genuinely open question, one that even biographers who spent years researching his life have never fully resolved. Some argue the mere possibility of exposure was often enough to shape behavior without any explicit threat ever being made. Others suggest the extent of Hoover's influence has been somewhat mythologized over the decades, growing larger in retelling than the surviving evidence can fully support. What remains clear is that the FBI, under Hoover's leadership, operated with a degree of independence and information gathering that few other agencies in American history have matched, a legacy that continued shaping conversations about the proper boundaries of domestic intelligence work long after Hoover himself was gone. 43. FBI's investigation of the Unabomber, and speaking of manhunts that stretched on for years with the whole country watching, let's talk about one of the strangest and most patient investigations in FBI history. Between 1978 and 1995, a series of package bombs killed 3 people and injured 23 others across the United States. The devices were meticulously crafted, sent to universities and airlines, which led the FBI to give the case the internal codename UNABOM, standing for University and Airline Bomber. For years, the investigation went essentially nowhere. the bomber left almost no physical evidence. He built his devices from scratch using materials that couldn't be traced. He moved across state lines to mail his packages from different locations, making patterns nearly impossible to establish. Hundreds of agents worked the case. Thousands of leads were chased down. It became one of the longest and most expensive manhunts in FBI history, and still there was no suspect, no name, nothing solid to go on. Then in 1995, the bomber, later identified as Ted Kaczynski, a former mathematics professor who had abandoned academia for an isolated cabin in Montana, sent a lengthy manifesto to major newspapers. He promised to stop the bombings if the document, which criticized industrial society and technological progress, was published in full. After considerable debate among law enforcement and the papers themselves, the Washington Post and New York Times agreed to print it, partly out of hope that someone might recognize the writing style. That decision turned out to be the break the investigation needed. Kaczynski's own brother David read the published manifesto and noticed something unsettling familiar in the phrasing and ideas, echoes of letters and essays Ted had written to family over the years. After an agonizing period of doubt, David contacted the FBI, providing them with old letters for comparison. Linguistic analysis suggested a strong match. In April of 1996, FBI agents arrested Kaczynski at his remote Montana cabin, where they also discovered a live bomb, journals detailing his activities, and an original copy of the manifesto. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. The case remains a strange study in patience and coincidence, a 17-year investigation that was ultimately solved not through forensic breakthroughs or technology, but through a brother's uneasy recognition of familiar words in a newspaper. It also remains one of the few times a major terrorism investigation was resolved through publishing the demands of the person responsible, a decision that was controversial then and is still debated by journalists and historians today. 44. The mysterious death of Frank Olson. And speaking of investigations where the full truth may never really be settled, let's talk about a death that has puzzled historians and the Olson family alike for over 70 years. Frank Olson was a biochemist working for the United States Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland, involved in research connected to the CIA's mind control program, MKUltra, which we've touched on earlier in this list. In November of 1953, Olson attended a retreat with colleagues where, unbeknownst to him, CIA officials had dosed his drink with LSD as part of ongoing experiments into the drug's effects on unsuspecting subjects. In the days that followed, Olson reportedly became anxious, disoriented, and deeply distressed, exhibiting what colleagues later described as a serious psychological break. He was taken to New York for what was described as psychiatric treatment. On the night of November 28, 1953, Olson fell from the window of his 10th floor hotel room and died. At the time, his death was ruled a suicide, the tragic result of a psychotic episode brought on by the undisclosed drugging. For over 20 years, that was the official story his family was given, without ever being told about the LSD or the CIA's involvement. Then in 1975, the Rockefeller Commission's investigation into CIA abuses revealed that Olson had been secretly drugged before his death, a detail that had been withheld from his family for over 2 decades. The Olson family received a formal apology from President Ford and a financial settlement from the government, but many questions remained unanswered. Years later, Olson's son, Eric, grew convinced that his father's death was not a suicide at all, but something closer to a killing, motivated by fears that Olson, troubled by the ethics of the biological weapons work he'd witnessed, might expose classified programs. In 1994, the family had Olson's body exhumed, and a forensic examination noted injuries some experts felt were inconsistent with a fall alone. Though this interpretation has been disputed by other specialists, no criminal charges were ever filed, and the case was eventually closed without a definitive resolution. Whether Frank Olson's death was the tragic accident of a man broken by an experiment gone wrong, or something far more deliberate, remains genuinely unresolved, a question resting somewhere in classified files that may never be fully opened, or perhaps in memories that no longer exist to be questioned at all. 45. FBI's use of polygraph testing. And speaking of tools whose reliability has never been fully settled, let's talk about the FBI's long relationship with the polygraph machine. Since the early 20th century, the Bureau has used polygraph examinations, commonly called lie detector tests, as part of hiring screenings, security clearance evaluations, and criminal investigations. The device measures physiological responses, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing patterns, and skin conductivity, based on the theory that deception produces measurable stress responses that truthful answers do not. Generations of FBI applicants have sat through these exams, answering questions about drug use, foreign contacts, and personal history, often believing that the machine offered a scientifically reliable way to catch dishonesty. The trouble is that the scientific community has never fully agreed on how reliable polygraph testing actually is. Numerous studies over the decades have suggested that skilled individuals can be trained to beat the test through controlled breathing or physical countermeasures, while anxious but entirely honest people can sometimes trigger readings that look deceptive simply because of nerves. The National Academy of Sciences released a report in 2003 concluding that polygraph evidence lacked the scientific validity needed for security screening purposes, and courts across the country have generally been reluctant to admit polygraph results as evidence in criminal trials for exactly this reason. And yet, despite these persistent doubts, the FBI and many other federal agencies have continued relying on the technique for decades, arguing that even an imperfect tool provides some value in narrowing down concerns or prompting admissions during questioning. Critics counter that this practice has likely disqualified truthful applicants who simply reacted nervously under pressure, while occasionally allowing more composed, deceptive individuals to pass through undetected. The case of Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who spied for the Soviet Union for years while repeatedly passing polygraph examinations, is often cited as a troubling example of the test's limitations, though defenders of the practice argue his case reflects failures in follow-up investigation rather than the polygraph itself. The debate continues today, a strange, quiet tension between an institution that has relied on this technology for generations and a scientific community that has never fully endorsed it. Perhaps it says something about how organizations often continue using familiar tools long after certainty about their effectiveness has faded, choosing the comfort of routine over the discomfort of admitting a long-standing method might never have been as precise as it once seemed. 46. CIA's funding of Nicaraguan Contras. And speaking of covert operations that stretched across an entire decade before the full picture finally came into focus, let's talk about one of the most consequential and controversial CIA programs of the 1980s. After the Sandinista National Liberation Front overthrew Nicaragua's Somoza dictatorship in 1979 and installed a socialist government, the Reagan administration grew deeply concerned about Soviet and Cuban influence spreading through Central America. In response, the CIA began covertly organizing, training, and funding a coalition of rebel groups known collectively as the Contras, short for Contra-Revolucionarios, counter-revolutionaries, with the goal of overthrowing the Sandinista government. The agency provided weapons, military training, and financial support, operating largely out of neighboring Honduras, where Contra forces staged raids across the border. Congress grew uneasy with the scale of the operation and passed the Boland Amendment in 1982. Restricting and eventually cutting off direct U.S. funding for Contra military activities. The story might have ended there, a program quietly reined in by legislative oversight, except that members of the Reagan administration found other ways to keep the funding flowing. This led to the Iran Contra affair, one of the most tangled scandals in American political history, in which senior officials secretly sold weapons to Iran, then under an arms embargo, and funneled the profits to the Contras in direct violation of congressional restrictions. When the scheme was exposed in 1986, it triggered congressional hearings, criminal indictments, and a scandal that dominated headlines for years. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North became a household name after admitting he had shredded documents and helped orchestrate the secret funding pipeline. Several officials were convicted of charges ranging from obstruction to lying to Congress, though many convictions were later overturned on appeal or pardoned altogether. Human rights organizations documented serious abuses committed by Contra forces during the conflict, including attacks on civilians, though the extent of direct CIA knowledge or approval of these specific incidents remains debated among historians. What is well established is that the agency's broader support helped sustain a prolonged and bloody civil war that claimed tens of thousands of lives on Nicaraguan soil. The International Court of Justice ruled in 1986 that the United States had violated international law in its actions against Nicaragua, ordering reparations that were never paid. The Contra War eventually wound down as peace negotiations took hold in the late 1980s. and the Sandinistas lost power in a 1990 election, many viewed as a turning point toward reconciliation. Whether the program should be remembered primarily as a Cold War necessity or a case study in executive overreach remains a question historians continue to wrestle with today, a debate rooted not in speculation, but in mountains of declassified documents and congressional testimony that still leave room for interpretation. 47. FBI's investigation into the JFK assassination. And speaking of investigations that left almost as many questions as answers, let's talk about the FBI's role in one of the most examined events in American history. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated while riding in a motorcade through Dallas, Texas. Within hours, the FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, launched an enormous investigation, ultimately compiling tens of thousands of pages of interviews, ballistic reports, and witness statements. The Bureau's findings became the foundation for the Warren Commission, the presidential panel tasked with determining what happened and why. The commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, firing 3 shots from the Texas Schoolbook Depository, and that no conspiracy, foreign or domestic, was involved. For many Americans at the time, this offered a measure of closure to an unthinkable tragedy. For others, questions lingered almost immediately. Some researchers pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline, questions about the trajectory of certain shots, and testimony from witnesses that didn't always align neatly with the official narrative. Over the decades, subsequent congressional investigations, including the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s, re-examined the evidence and concluded there was a scientific probability, based on acoustic analysis later disputed by other experts, that a second gunman may have been involved, though the committee could not identify who that might have been or determine a larger conspiracy. Complicating matters further, historians later learned that Hoover's FBI had been aware of Oswald prior to the assassination, having monitored his activities due to his defection to the Soviet Union and later contact with Cuban and Soviet officials in Mexico City. Some documents suggest information sharing between agencies was incomplete or delayed, fueling decades of speculation about what more might have been known beforehand. It's worth noting that no credible, evidence-based investigation has ever definitively proven a broader conspiracy, and many historians maintain the original Warren Commission conclusions remain the most supported by available evidence. Still, the government's decision to classify certain assassination-related files for decades, some only released in the 2010s and others still redacted today, has kept public curiosity alive far longer than officials likely anticipated. Whether those remaining pages contain nothing more than routine Cold War intelligence notes or something that might further shape our understanding of that day in Dallas, is a question historians and researchers continue to ask, patiently waiting for archives that open a little more with each passing year. 48. CIA's alleged connections to Watergate. And speaking of scandals where old intelligence careers seem to resurface at exactly the wrong moment, let's talk about the shadow the CIA has long cast over the Watergate affair. In June of 1972, 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., an event that eventually unraveled into the resignation of President Richard Nixon 2 years later. What made the break-in especially curious from the start was who these men turned out to be. Several of them, including James McCord and E. Howard Hunt, had previously worked for the CIA, McCord as a former security officer and Hunt as a former operative involved in earlier Cold War operations, including some connected to the Bay of Pigs invasion we've touched on earlier in this list. Their prior intelligence backgrounds immediately raised questions in the press and among investigators about whether the burglary might have deeper institutional roots, rather than being a purely political dirty trick organized independently by the Nixon campaign. The CIA has consistently maintained that the break-in was not an authorized agency operation, and no definitive evidence has ever surfaced proving the agency organized or ordered the Watergate burglary itself. However, subsequent investigations revealed that the CIA had, at Nixon's request, provided disguises and equipment to Hunt for a separate earlier operation, and that agency officials initially cooperated with efforts to limit the FBI's investigation into Watergate by falsely suggesting national security concerns were at stake. This attempted use of the CIA to obstruct an FBI investigation became a central piece of evidence in Nixon's eventual impeachment proceedings, captured famously on the White House tapes in a conversation now referred to as the smoking gun recording. Historians remain divided over how much of Watergate reflects a broader intelligence community entanglement versus a story primarily about a small circle of Nixon loyalists using former agency men because of their specialized skills and adaptability rather than any deeper institutional plot. Some researchers have pointed to the burglars' past training and lingering connections as evidence suggesting the operation may have drawn on old professional networks in ways that were never fully investigated. Others argue the available evidence simply shows individuals who happen to share a professional background, nothing more sinister than convenience and familiarity. What remains clear is that the incident permanently damaged public trust in intelligence agencies and elected officials alike, feeding a growing skepticism toward government institutions that would only deepen as more revelations from this list continued to surface throughout the decade. The full extent of any deeper connections, if they exist at all, remains a quiet, unresolved thread in an otherwise thoroughly documented chapter of American history. 49. The FBI's National Academy Training Program. And speaking of institutions that shaped how power operates far beyond their own walls, let's end with something that reveals just how deeply the FBI's influence spread into everyday policing across the country. Since 1935, the FBI has run the National Academy, a training program based at Quantico, Virginia, designed to bring in law enforcement leaders from across the United States and eventually from around the world. Local police chiefs, sheriffs, and command staff would spend 10 weeks studying forensic science, leadership, legal updates, and behavioral analysis, then return home to reshape their own departments based on what they'd learned. On paper, it sounds like exactly what you'd want, a way to standardize training and elevate professionalism in policing nationwide. And in many respects, that's exactly what it did. Graduates of the program often went on to hold significant leadership roles, and the National Academy became something of a prestigious credential in law enforcement circles, a shared experience that created networks of alumni stretching across state lines and generations. But influence like that comes with quieter implications too. When one federal agency trains thousands of local leaders over the decades, it doesn't just teach forensic techniques, it shapes a certain worldview, a certain approach to law enforcement culture that ripples outward long after each class graduates. Some historians and criminologists have noted that this created a kind of informal standardization, sometimes for the better, streamlining outdated practices, and sometimes simply spreading the FBI's own institutional habits and blind spots into departments that might never have developed them otherwise. The program has also served, intentionally or not, as a subtle extension of federal reach into what is technically a patchwork of independent local and state policing systems, each with its own laws, oversight, and accountability structures. Whether that's a benefit to consistency and professionalism, or a quiet erosion of local independence, tends to depend on who you ask. What's certain is that thousands of law enforcement leaders have passed through Quantico's doors since the 1930s, carrying pieces of the FBI's institutional philosophy back to towns and cities the Bureau itself would never directly police. It's a reminder that influence doesn't always arrive through scandal or covert operation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through classrooms, curriculums, and the slow, steady shaping of an entire profession's culture, one graduating class at a time. 50. CIA's Operation Mongoose. And speaking of programs designed to quietly shape outcomes far beyond what the public ever saw, let's close this list with the operation that tied together so many of the threads we've already pulled on tonight. In the aftermath of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, the Kennedy administration authorized a sprawling covert program known as Operation Mongoose, a coordinated effort by the CIA, the Department of Defense, and other agencies to destabilize and ultimately remove Fidel Castro's government in Cuba. Unlike a single operation, Mongoose was closer to an umbrella, encompassing sabotage missions against Cuban infrastructure, economic disruption efforts, propaganda campaigns, and, according to later congressional investigations, a series of assassination plots aimed at Castro himself, some involving remarkably unusual methods that read more like spy fiction than sober government planning. Poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, and chemical agents meant to make Castro's beard fall out were all reportedly discussed or attempted in various forms, though how seriously each plan was pursued remains debated among historians. The program also connected to the fake Cuban exile groups we touched on earlier, and it operated under the broader belief, common in Washington at the time, that removing Castro was both necessary and achievable through persistent layered pressure. The Church Committee hearings of the 1970s later confirmed many of these details, revealing just how far the government had been willing to go in pursuit of a single political outcome, without congressional oversight and largely outside public knowledge. Operation Mongoose was quietly wound down after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962 made the risks of continued provocation against Cuba, and by extension the Soviet Union, too dangerous to continue pursuing so aggressively. Castro remained in power for decades afterward, outlasting 9 U.S. presidents and the countless plans meant to remove him. Whether Mongoose should be remembered as reckless Cold War overreach or a rational response to genuine geopolitical fears remains, like so much on this list, a matter of historical interpretation rather than settled fact. What is certain is that it stands as one of the clearest examples of how deeply intertwined secrecy, fear, and power became during those decades, a pattern that echoes through nearly every story we've covered tonight. And with that quiet, unresolved thread, we close this list, 50 declassified pieces of a much larger, ever-unfolding story, one that history continues to reveal slowly, page by page, as the archives keep opening.